Good evening, and thank you so much for being part of this conversation. I want to thank Councilwoman Anthony and Councilwoman LaFortune. I also want to thank Rep. Agello and Rep. Kislak for being here for part of the conversation. So essentially what we want to talk about today is going to be broken down into two parts. The first one is the city's finances, and second is the proposal that we put forth to solve some of the challenges that we have. On the first one, I think it's really important for us to continue to talk about this. We have some major and serious challenges. Now the trick, right, and part of the challenge that we have on the administration side is that we have a lot of really positive news to share about the progress we've made with our finances. Most of that progress is with respect to our short-term finances. So on the one hand, we're having record surpluses. We're also creating a rainy day fund, paying off the deficit, budgeting responsibly, having our credit rating upgraded. So all of that is great. But how can we square this while at the same time talking about this looming financial challenge that's off into the future? I hope that when we walk out of the room today, folks will have a clearer understanding of how both of those things can be true. How our finances can be short over the short term, but still have a looming threat over the long term. The second reason why I think it's important for us to continue to have this conversation is because no one knows exactly when those long-term challenges are going to become so acute that receivership and bankruptcy are back on the table as an imminent possibility. It could be 10 years, it could be 15 years. No one knows exactly when. But I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that the longer that we wait, the more serious and more acute that imminent threat is going to become. But also, the more difficult it is going to be for us to do something about it. So what we're hoping to do is continue to sound the alarm and raise awareness of those challenges so that we can act now. So that's one part of the conversation for today. The second part of the presentation is not just ringing the alarm and alerting us to the challenges, but also proposing a real, tangible, earnest solution that we're putting forward. Now this solution is massively complicated politically, financially, politically, and or logistically. So it's incredibly complicated, and we want to share with you why we think this is the best solution. In fact, not just it being the best solution, but simply remembering that in situations like this, there is no ideal outcome, there is no ideal solution. And frankly, being mayor of the city of Providence, sometimes the choice is which of all the possible outcomes is less worse. And so I'm happy to answer any questions as we get going into the presentation of perhaps folks have ideas, well, will this work? Will that work? Have you considered this? Have you considered that? I want you to know that all of this has been informed by years and years of work, not only by administrations and city councils before this administration came in, but as soon as we took office, we commissioned a 160-page report by the National Resource Network. And they presented the challenges with a number of different solutions, and all of that is publicly available. We had about 35 stakeholders in the community that helped inform it. I also want to recognize Councilman Sam Zurier, who's been a leading voice on this for quite a while, and he, on his role in the city council, led a committee to also study this issue. So there's a wealth of knowledge there that has also informed our thinking, and of course, this has been talked about in the community for quite a while, going back at least a couple of decades. So that's the second part of the presentation. In order to do the presentation, we're going to be led by the Chief of Staff, Nicole Pollock, who I'll hand the microphone over to right now. And after she's done, we also have a panel of folks in my administration. I have my Director of Finance, I have my City Solicitor, and also my Director of Sustainability. So if there are any technical questions that come from the audience on the finances, on the legal aspects, or on the environmental side of it, we also have the leading directors from my administration here to answer any questions. So once again, thank you very much for being a part of this conversation, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly review one more thing, and then I'll actually get into it. I know you've gotten a lot of introductions and information. We are going to do a Q&A at the end. We've handed out note cards so that if questions come up while the presentation is happening that you're afraid you might forget, feel free to write them down, and if you don't want to ask the question, we're happy to take your note card and we'll aggregate them at the end, and if there are themes from the different comments or questions, we'll look at those and try to answer all of those questions or comments at the end as well. So it looks like Teresa's handing them out, so raise your hand, both of you need them, or if you have one and you'd like one of our staff members to pick them up. Okay, I'm going to jump in. Okay, so where we were is pre-Elorza administration. I came to work for the city for Mayor Elorza, so I'm not super familiar with all of the executive decisions that happened before that. But where we were before is high tax rates. We still have high tax rates, and again, that's likely to continue if we don't have a really earnest conversation about this issue. Limited funding for schools and infrastructure. This is obvious probably to all of you who walk into a public building or a school building because your children go to the public schools or you're participating in some public activity. We need to do better. The schools need to be in better condition, and part of that is unlocking some additional capacity within the city to make those investments. Constrained ability to provide services, this is tied to that as well. When we have a low bond rating, which I note next, we have a hard time borrowing money to be able to make investments throughout the city. We had no rainy day funds, so we had no ability, if there was a crisis that occurred, we had no dollars put aside to address the crisis. Most cities have a rainy day fund. We had none before we came in. And we had, and we still do, a looming unfunded pension liability. This is our $1 billion problem, and that is what we're here to talk to you about this evening. How did we get here? So you're saying, well, it sounds fairly irresponsible. And there are a series of decisions that brought us to this point. I'll talk about two of them. One of them is the city agreed in the early 90s to provide retirees with 5% and 6% COLAs, which are cost of living adjustments. That basically means that every year your retirement goes up 5 to 6%. I gave an example here. If you retired at a $50,000 salary and you got $30,000 in retirement, 15 years later, I think we're at 1981, 2001, 2012, so 20 years later, you're at $102,000 per year in your retirement. That's a very significant increase, and it's not one that the city can afford. The second thing that happened is the city did not make its full pension payments for 17 out of the 18 years in the 90s and early 2000s. So basically, we weren't paying our full mortgage, our full credit card bill, whatever you have it. So the interest has continued to accrue, the balance has continued to go up, and the funding status has continued to go down. We are now at a point where we are close to 25% funded for a pension that should be funded at 70%, 60 or 70% or better. One thing I'll note is if we had made all of those payments on time in the 90s and early 2000s, we would not be here having this conversation with you because the pension would be funded somewhere between 55 and 70%. Not perfect, but good enough for a public pension system. Here's just an overview of the unfunded pension liability. What you can see is it basically, sorry the numbers are blurry, but this is from the, again, early 90s to current day. You'll see that the numbers continue to go down in the funded status as the liability increases. So this is just basically illustrating how it balloons over the course of time. So what have we done to fix it? The mayor alluded to this, but I want to talk through a few short-term things that we have done. First, we've had operating surpluses for the past 3 years. We attribute this to better budgeting and also a better economy. This has allowed us to make some investments in our rainy day fund, like I talked about before, and also our healthcare fund. So we do have a balance now in a fund to protect the city's finances if we're in an emergency. We still need to build up those reserves further. They should be at around 5% of your operating budget. We're nowhere close to that at this point, but we're getting there. We've erased the cumulative deficit as well. We have shown balanced budgets in our 5-year projections, so the next 5 years out, the city actually looks like it's in fairly okay shape. Again, assuming state funding stays the same, assuming we don't change the tax structure, so you're going to continue to see taxes slowly increase over time. And we've also made 100% of our retirement payments. We've also improved our credit ratings. Why does this matter? This is like This is like having a really good credit score, right? You get better deals for credit cards. You're more likely to get loans for your home or for other things that you would like loans for. So the city at this point has improved its credit rating, but as you can see, we're not at like A+ status up there. We're an improved outlook, but we still could do a whole lot better. The way we do a whole lot better is addressing our unfunded pension liability. Why does this matter? Again, if we're going to continue to make investments, the investment world that makes those investments need to think that we're a secure deal. Right now, we're considered to be a fairly risky deal, though getting better. Okay, we've improved our business climate. I just pulled a quick overview of some of the permit fees that the city has taken in over the past few years. Those have increased almost threefold to what they were in the previous decade. So we've seen a huge healthy growth in the economy in the city. You probably see this when you drive around. There's new developments happening, homes being renovated. It brings its own host of other challenges related to affordable housing, which is not something we're here to talk about tonight, but definitely a conversation that needs to be had. We will be having with the community, but it is really good for our numbers and for our business climate. What we've also done is implemented a long-term capital planning process. This might sound obvious, but when we came into office, we didn't know when the next planned road investment or sidewalk investment or when the next investment in our city buildings or rec centers, schools was going to happen because there was no plan in place for that. Most cities have a 5-year or 10-year capital plan that they use so that even if they don't completely follow it, there's at least a guidebook for what needs to happen. And it also helps drive regular maintenance of things like roads, sidewalks, so that when a crack appears, it's filled and the road lasts a few years longer. And that's what we've put in place. So the city put in a capital plan 3 years ago and is now bonded against that plan twice, which basically means we financed it twice, and we'll continue to put that practice in place throughout our departments and throughout the city. The goal with that practice is to improve our road conditions, improve our sidewalks, improve our public schools, improve our rec centers, all the things that you experience in the public realm of the city. Again, we're still at the very beginning of this. It's going to take a long time for this to come to fruition and for everyone to see the results, but it's a practice that we've committed ourselves to. One piece I'm excited to talk about is with the capital planning process in the school side, we were able to leverage the state investment, and then voters in the city voted for a city-side school bond. We have put a $310 million application into the Rhode Island Department of Education for improvements to schools in the next 5 years, and we're actually pulling a plan together for a $500 million investment in our schools. I will note that only scratches the surface. Our schools need even more than that, but this is the first long-term, very large investment that we've been looking at in a few decades. So these are some of the practices we've been putting in place that were recommended through that report that the mayor talked about to help deal with our major long-term financial and city challenges. I forgot to check. Can you hear me in the back? Okay. So pension reform. People ask us a lot or say, hey, why don't you do pension reform? And the answer is we actually did do pension reform. So in 2012, the city went through a pension reform process under the Tavares administration. Through that pension reform, those COLAs that I talked about, those cost of living expenses that drove up 5 to 6% every year, those were frozen until 2023. And we also changed healthcare benefits for retirees as well. So we made some major gains in that pension reform, but we did not fix all the problems that are before us. It helped fix some major short-term problems the city had in terms of finances, but again, those COLAs come back in 2023, and we have continued, and also assumes that we're going to continue to get the same amount of funding from the state, and it assumes that taxes continue to rise. I guess I could talk about, I want to just note a few other things that happened. Cicilline administration reinstated the full pension payments that I mentioned before. That's when those came back into play. Tavares administration did the same pension reform, and now what we're doing is some of those short-term things, continuing to make full pension payments and having this bigger conversation with you about our longer-term finances. Okay, I think I talked through this. So one thing, again, we hear about is, well, why don't you do pension reform for current and future employees? Why don't you change your benefit structure for teachers, for municipal staff, fire, and police? What this graph illustrates is that that wouldn't have a huge impact, and at this point we are considered to be average to low in the competitiveness scale for those types of jobs. As a mid-sized city that needs excellent service and staff, we can't keep chipping away at employee benefits. But what you can see here is, you can't quite see, so I'll just say, this is the amount of our pension payment that goes towards retirees, so people who already are retired. This is the percentage, this is about 10%, it's 9.8%, that goes to current and future employees. So when we're making that payment, that's how that breaks down. Most of the payment, 90% of the payment, is going to retirees. So the point I'm trying to make there is our biggest issue is with people who are no longer in unions or part of collective bargaining agreements. So even if we take that on, we move the needle, but only so slightly. So, and it is something we've taken on, so I guess I'm going to talk about the other pieces. We have reduced leave and some benefits for our staff. We also have changed our health benefits significantly for every group of municipal employees. In the fire department, we reduced minimum manning and made some pretty major shifts in all of our contracts as recommended again by that report that the mayor referenced. I want to note, we keep talking about this thing, the NRN report. If you're saying, what is this mystical document? On our website, we have a link to a page that goes an overview on this and that particular report and a few of the other pension reports that are done, if you want to look at that.
Can you give the name of that again, please?
Yep, sorry. It's the National Resource Network, and they did a long-term financial plan for the city. And if you can Google it, or you can go to our website and you'll find it. We also have looked at increasing taxes and fees. What I'm noting right after that is those increases on an annual basis have an impact of about $500,000 to about $2 million per year. I note that because we would have to probably increase or create 5 or 10 new taxes to be able to get the amount that we would need annually to have an impact on this issue. So we've actually looked at increasing the hotel tax, which the city gets a small share of, and we actually introduced a bill and it was not successful on this. We also looked at the meal and beverage tax increase, again requires state approval, did not get a warm reception. We also explored a parking tax. We've looked at taxing nonprofits, which I'll talk about in a second. And we've also increased, to some extent, our pilot dollars from nonprofit institutions. The legislation related to nonprofits, because this comes up a lot, what we put in is legislation that would tax non-mission essential parcels at a commercial rate. So for instance, if you're a nonprofit and you own a parcel that a restaurant that's making profit is using, or maybe you have a coffee shop, that particular building or square footage would be taxed at a commercial rate. To be fair, a lot of our nonprofits do that already. Brown is one that holds all of its for-profit buildings in a separate company, and they do pay taxes. But again, this is an area where we could make some gains, but it wouldn't be super significant. It probably would be something between $1 to $2 million per year. Are there other alternatives? There are, I talked about some of them, but it's increasing taxes and fees for residents, decreasing the quality of city services, so we could definitely, we could potentially cut city services further. That is an option, but again, that comes with a decrease in service and probably a decrease in some of the planning and long-term strategy pieces that I just talked about. Decrease in school investments, as we all know, this is just not an option. The city needs to be investing more in its schools, both its buildings and in the instruction that's provided within the walls of those buildings. We owe that to ourselves, our kids, the future of the city. And then decrease parks and recreation opportunities, so stopping and reducing our investments in outdoor spaces that we own. These are really the areas that we control and have an opportunity to potentially reduce, but again, these are not propositions or not things that we want to really look further into without looking at other solutions. So that's an overview of the city's finances and why we have a $1 billion problem and kind of what we're trying to do to address that problem. What I want to do is move into kind of the water conversation. I'm partially separating it because we know that this part of the conversation, again, is more controversial and is a part of the conversation that we'll have a lot of discussion about. But again, we've looked at a lot of these smaller interventions, and both politically, they're not something we're getting a lot of support for, and two, you have to do so many of them that we'd have to have success implementing probably